Today, we're going to be talking about America and its role in World War One. I'm going to say from the outset that World War One is very important in Europe and consequential. It's much less in American history. That's not to say that it's not relevant to the United States, but the bottom line is that while World War One casts an incredibly long shadow over Europe, it doesn't in the United States, mostly due to the fact that we simply weren't involved for very long. But let's talk about how we got involved. So, there are a couple of factors that are involved in the United States switching from a policy of neutrality at the start of the First World War to entering on the side of the Allies. Woodrow Wilson ran again in 1916 and won on the argument that he kept the United States out of the First World War. It's worth noting that in this conflict, there were essentially two sides. The two sides were involved of two different types of powers. So you had essentially the Central Powers on one side. That's predominantly Germany, the then Austro Hungarian Empire, and the waning Ottoman Empire. On the other side, you had the Entente powers, and those are Great Britain, France, Russia, and ultimately Italy, though they go back and forth. The United States had been approached multiple times by both sides, but really courted more by Great Britain, France, and to a lesser degree, Russia. It's worth pointing out that by 1917, Russia is no longer effectively in the war because the Bolshevik Revolution has taken place, the Tsar has been killed, and Russia is, while nominally still fighting, not really engaged in any major conflict anymore. But there's a couple of things that happen that really bring the United States in. The first is Germany throughout the war had been using submarine warfare to a large extent, more than in any other previous conflict. The British had the strongest navy in the world, and the German way to try to counteract that strength was to use a new type of naval warfare, namely what we call unrestricted submarine warfare, which means that German submarines would fire at any and all ships headed to or from the British Isles in an effort to try to starve the British into submission. Germany had gone back and forth on this policy because the United States was angry about it. In fact, when the Germans sank the Lusitania in 1915, which was a British vessel but had many American citizens on it, and lives were lost. And in fact, the American government was furious over this. So after 1915, the Germans stopped using unrestricted submarine warfare, but then in 1917 announced that they were going to resume again, mostly out of desperation. Then there was the Zimmermann telegram in 1917. In that year, the British intercepted a telegram from Germany to Mexico proposing an alliance against the United States. This further fueled public opinion against Germany and for the first time was seen as a direct threat. Now, of course, we should also note that there's really some broad issues going on here. One is economic and cultural interests. The US had strong economic ties and cultural ties with Great Britain and the other Allied powers, particularly through loans and trade. American businesses had a vested interest in seeing France, Russia, and Great Britain win this war, and we shouldn't discount that. Then, of course, there's this idealist approach. For Woodrow Wilson, this was a war about democracy. He famously said that it was a war that the United States would fight to make the world safe for democracy. What did he mean by that? What he really was looking at was France and Great Britain compared to what looked like two old world empires in Germany and the Austro Hungarian Empire, both of which had monarchs, though to in Germany to a much, much, much lesser extent, the monarch was important. So Wilson was able to frame this as a conflict about ideology. Now, of course, that ignores the fact that Russia had a czar, a king, and as a consequence, this argument doesn't make any sense. But Russia's exit from the war in 1917 is ultimately what allows the United States to come In April of that year, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war, and they agreed, officially bringing the United States into World War One. Now, if we look at the United States' involvement in World War One in particular, from a tactical standpoint, we're not important. We're not involved in any of the major battles that take place in World War One because we come in so late. However, it's a significant turning point, the American entrance, because America provides the possibility of endless manpower and resources to the Allied forces, which kind of changes the way the Germans have to fight the war. When the US declared war in April of 1917, its army was incredibly small. The Selective Service Act was passed to draft men into military service, which did allow them to relatively quickly expand. The US also faced considerable challenges in transporting troops and supplies across the Atlantic. We had to use all kinds of makeshift solutions, including boats we had actually seized from the Germans because we didn't have a very big navy at the time. What ultimately gets sent over is referred to as the AEF, or American Expeditionary Force, which was led by General John Pershing. They arrived in France of June of 1917, but it wasn't really until 1918 that they were engaged in full combat, really as the war is coming to an end. Initially, American troops were just kind of integrated with British and French units to gain experience, um, participating in small scale attacks and things like that. As more and more troops arrived, the AEF started to operate more independently. In the later stages of the war, the AEF launched a couple of major offensives, including the Battle of Saint Mihiel and the Maurice Argonne offensive. What's interesting about some of these offensives is they are launched really as the war is coming to an end. In fact, when both sides agreed to the armistice on November 11th, 1918, um, General Pershing is still launching attacks, even as he is well aware the next day, in fact, the war is going to come to an end. And so he gets some criticism for needlessly throwing lives away when honestly there's no purpose to it. But the arrival of fresh American troops provided a significant morale boost to weary Allied forces. And the sheer number that were being sent is really what allowed the Americans to tip the balance. And of course, as I mentioned before, the US had an industrial base with which they could support the war to a much larger extent, even than Russia, who was now out. And so, while the US entered the war relatively late, its military and economic contributions, as well as its ability to protect the British Navy from German U boats and allowing the flow of supplies to Europe, did allow the Allies to win the war and also um, marked a turning point and solidified the US's emergence as a global power. The US really suffered very few casualties as a consequence of the war, but frankly, the only reason that our casualty rates were not higher is because we were not involved in the war earlier. Had we been involved in the war earlier, that 53,000 casualty mark, which doesn't include wounded, would have been much higher. And actually, at the very tail end of the war, the Spanish flu breaks out, which is a form of influenza. And it's a very devastating plague that ravishes the world. We lose more soldiers dead from the Spanish flu than we lose from any of conflict that we fought in. If the US didn't play a major role in the fighting itself, Woodrow Wilson did play a major role in the peace process. He set forth what he was called the 14 points, or a 14-point strategy for not only ending the war, but trying to bring lasting peace to Europe. It's obviously not going to work, as the next war is going to break out about 20 years later. But it was a notable effort. And there are many German scholars who argue that when the Germans surrender, in 1919, what they're surrendering to is Wilson's version of peace and not what they originally get. So essentially, Wilson advocated for a couple of things. One was open diplomacy. He didn't like the secret treaties that these countries would enter into to grab land or strategic places. He thought that that only fostered future wars. He wanted a freedom of the seas, free trade, arms reduction. One of the most important points was he believed in self determination, the right of nations and ethnic groups to determine their own political status and governance. But the most important thing was that he wanted what he called the League of Nations. This is a precursor to the United Nations. And the idea was that the League would be an overall peacekeeping force throughout the world, and do really what the UN is supposed to do today, which is to step in and prevent the emergence of another global war. Wilson's idealism and leadership were evident when he arrived in Paris in 1919 for the peace negotiations. He tried to incorporate many of the 14 points into the peace settlement, but Britain and France had different priorities. They were much more focused on punishing Germany for what they believed was starting the conflict, and doing so, all they did was sow seeds of further conflict and the Second World War. He was actually able, Wilson was, to incorporate the League of Nations into the treaty in the end. Unfortunately, though, we didn't end up joining because of incredible opposition, particularly from the Republican Party, to the treaty itself. America really, the big takeaway that I want you to hear from this is that America tends to go through these periods of integration or intervention in the foreign world, followed by long, protracted periods of isolationism when we don't want to engage in the rest of the world. Wilson's presidency marks the end of an integration period and the beginning of an isolationist period for the United States. And this is really typified by a lot of Republican senators, particularly Henry Cabot Lodge. He is, alongside the revisionists and the irreconcilables, were really refusing to support this treaty. And remember, it's up to the Senate to confirm a treaty with the United States. The president can't agree to a treaty on their own, they don't have the power to do so. Now, outside of Congress, public opinion was sharply divided. Some supported Wilson's vision for international peace, but others felt that the treaty was too harsh on Germany or that it prioritized European affairs over American interests. And many in America simply didn't want to be entangled with Europe any further. Wilson was determined to try to get public support for this treaty to be passed. So he went on a nationwide speaking tour in 1919 in the fall to try to galvanize local support for the treaty. Unfortunately, the tour was physically exhausting, and Wilson refused to slow down despite warnings from his advisors and doctors. On September the 25th, 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, he collapsed from exhaustion and was forced to return to Washington, D.C. Then, a few weeks later, on October 2nd, President Wilson suffered a massive stroke at the White House, which left him partially paralyzed and incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. His wife, Edith Wilson, took on a major role in managing his communications, often deciding which matters were brought to his attention, leading some historians to refer to Edith Wilson as the first female president. Due to Wilson's illness, he was unable to negotiate or campaign for the treaty's ratification, and as a consequence, the Senate twice rejected the signed Treaty of Versailles, first in November and then in March 1920. As a consequence, the United States never joined the League of Nations, which immediately weakened the organization's effectiveness. Wilson left office in 1921 after the end of his second term and was replaced by President Warren G. Harding. Wilson's health continued to deteriorate, and he died in February 1924 at the age of only 67. And as I mentioned, Wilson's big legacy is the failure of that treaty and the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations, which virtually guaranteed that the Second World War was going to happen. And really, it's a mark of the isolationism that the United States is going to pursue between 1919 and 1941, when the attack of Japan is going to force the United States to enter the Second World War.